So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Scott Tong. So the Hovey Lecture, as I mentioned, is named after Graham Hovey, the second director of Wallace House. But the idea of the Hovey Lecture and what Charles had in mind when he designed it was that every year, to start the new year, we would invite back a former fellow to talk about how the year transformed them, what it did for their work, where it pushed them that they weren't previously able to go or weren't thinking about going. And when I'm thinking of who to invite for a Hovey speaker, I'm also thinking about how is their work in the news? How can we bring back a former Knight-Wallace Fellow whose work during and after the fellowship helps to illuminate for our community something that we are hearing about daily in the news and possibly hearing about so much that we become slightly numb to it and don't have a chance to think about it deeply. And certainly China is in the news every day, multiple times a day now, and I happen to know a little bit about how Scott spent his fellowship year and the interesting way in which he was able to blend personal research about his family and the village his family came from with geopolitical research about China's on-again, off-again engagement with the world. Scott's a longtime China correspondent. You can read his bio in the program. I don't need to read it for you, but he and I also have in common, some of you know that I was based in East Asia for many years as well. And when Scott got into town yesterday, we sat and talked for a bit about starting our careers and working in Asia many years ago. And I built my career in Asia in the 1990s, and how some of the things that we reported then as facts about the world just now appear to not be true at all. I'm looking at Anthony and have told him before, when I was based in East Asia, Aung San Suu Kyi was a hero. And then she wasn't. When we started working in East Asia, we were all leaning into being global citizens. And the notion of borders, the idea was that borders would just keep opening. And we would all be global citizens, and countries would participate, and that democratic principles were to be valued. I don't need to say what state we're in with that. I started by studying in Taiwan, and then I moved to Hong Kong. And I would have never before the past year thought that I would ever be entertaining the notion that Taiwan might be really attacked by China. Not China having provocations off the coast, which happened all the time, but a real danger of an attack. And suddenly Mr. Putin has made that a real possibility. And we've all seen what has happened to Hong Kong, which we all thought after the handover in 1997 that things had gone better than planned, that democracy was holding on, and for the past several years it's been slipping and slipping and slipping. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Scott Tong, who's now the host of Here and Now, and one of the things I mentioned to Scott yesterday is that I love the perspective that his current job brings, because as a reporter and as a bureau chief based in China, he spent his time going deep. And as a show host, you have to be constantly moving between 10-minute interviews every day. And his ability to understand things with depth and communicate them in a way that has people who are in their cars and moving through their day paying attention is a real gift. And Scott Tong has been a gift to our program, and so I will welcome you to give the Hovey Lecture.
Well, thank you, Lynette. Thank you, Tabby. Thank you all for coming out. I got flashbacks when I was hearing the introductions, because we only do it 6,000 times in the course of the fellowship. But my goodness, the work that this group does, I'm honored to be back in this program, honored to be giving the Hovey Lecture, honored to be in your company. So this is a very special place for me and a great group. So look forward to talking to you about the year you have ahead. This is one of my favorite places, and I say that even though I have a spouse who's from Ohio and refers to the land from the north. My year, just briefly, was the Fellows' year of 2013 and 2014. So worst winter ever here, and as it got colder and the snow came, I was reassured that they never canceled school until they canceled school. It was that cold, and at the start, I had purchased all kinds of stuff to be ready for the Michigan winter, and I had my long johns and my double socks and my hat and this really expensive coat. And so the first day I went out, I was like, I can handle this. It was like wind chill minus 22 or something, and I think by the third day I was scared just to handle this. So Ann Arbor has redeemed itself weather-wise, as Lynette told me yesterday. What a moment to talk about journalism in this moment, and the value of a program like this. To me, it was the value of just connecting with one another. Journalism can be a pretty individual thing sometimes, but also with the university. The big thing, I'm in the audio space, and the big thing in audio now is what we call the group edit, where you're working on a long thing and people will come from all these different perspectives and kind of listen and provide feedback. It's a team thing that I kind of wasn't really used to. And for me, the year, the Knight-Wallace year, was kind of a big group edit. And I think what you may have already learned, is it will be a special relationship with the members of the faculty. And it took me a while to kind of grasp that, coming from this Confucian background where the teacher has a certain status. And suddenly, the teachers were almost as interested in me as I was in them. And that was different, and it was rewarding. And the ways that people wanted to help us to do our jobs. And I don't have to talk to you about what's at stake. What you all are living is what's at stake here. I was trying to think about how to talk about the value of journalism, but we just have to think about the places where freedom of speech doesn't really exist or barely exists. So thanks to all of you as I remember to set my my watch here. I'm on deadline every day. I forgot to set my watch. So I'll talk about what I've learned, and over the years what I've gotten wrong about trying to understand China, the Chinese people, the stories they tell themselves, how Chinese people and leaders understand their place in the world. And I'll talk about some of the early signs I saw of rising illiberalism and authoritarianism that preceded Xi Jinping. So I was based in China before the Xi Jinping era. I was living there from 2006 to 2010 in Shanghai. I was a business reporter for the public radio show Marketplace. And then I went back several times after that to work on a book project that finally, 4 years after the fellowship ended, was able to push across the finish line and get published. It'll never happen to you. Everything you do will be on time. But China, I think, is a place where and I'm ethnic Chinese. I grew up, my parents left as children before the communists came. I, went to international school at Taipei American School just across the water. So I thought I knew what I had in store, and it was daily my assumptions being challenged and tested. And for a journalist, I think that's the greatest thing, right, is to be tested and to be shown where you might be wrong. And then I'll talk about this pattern we're observing around the world, what we're learning about authoritarianism abroad here, what we're learning about populism, what I've learned as a journalist, and how journalism fits into that. And then I look forward to your questions, which is always weird because I ask questions for a living. So I guess I'll talk about the big error or misperception I had when I first went to China to kind of understand it. And as a business reporter, you're kind of looking at the growth, and China was growing at the first year, full year I was there in 2007, it grew at like 12%. So it was just this enormous thing, and it leads easily to the misperception or the incomplete perception that China is this instant story. And we've all heard this, right? That reform began just a generation ago under Deng Xiaoping, and China just, the economic miracle. We know all of the cliches about that. And when I went to China, I told all those stories too, because you hear that everywhere. The starting point for most people when you ask them about their lives, including my cousin, my dad got out and several of his siblings did not. I learned a lot about the people who got left behind, and most of them start the story when the reform and opening came in late 70s, early 80s, when China gradually started to open up, bring in the market economy, and people's lives changed. And I'll just kind of tell one story about this perception. I parachuted in before living in China. It was 2004, I believe. And they sent me to a far western city of Chongqing, the gigantic city on the Yangtze River where my father was born, actually. And so I hired a fixer and an interpreter because I speak Mandarin, but I don't speak the local dialect, the Sichuan dialect there. So I hired a translator, a very skilled and bilingual college student. And her English was incredible. So, as we were traveling there, I said, why is your English so good? And she said, well, I watched every episode of Friends and Sex and the City. And I love Friends, which is why my name is Rachel. So she gave herself the name Rachel. So Rachel and I go, and actually a couple days later, she works up the courage to ask a very serious question, and that was, who's your favorite character in Friends, and why? So Rachel and I go to Western China, and we profile this fascinating guy who's really kind of a picture of the heroes of China, these migrant workers who live in the countryside, and they go to the big cities. And we found this porter. So you may have seen photos, or if you've been to China or other places, you see these people with these giant bamboo sticks that they carry over their back, and they're paid, a small amount of money to do all of that. And they can attach these ropes to carry big boxes or food, or I saw someone carry a refrigerator kind of attached to the thing, because the city of Chongqing is a very up and down hilly city, and so that's often how people kind of transport stuff. They walk and they pay somebody to take their stuff. And this guy's name was Mr. Xu. And he's very skinny. His face is very weathered by working outside. And he's one of the poorest people in town. People really look down on these migrant workers in China. And we said, well, we want to understand your story. Could you take us to your village? And he said, yeah. So we go on a bus, and actually he's from the same village that Deng Xiaoping, the former Chinese leader, is from. So it's a great radio story, right? You go to where some of this was changing. And Mr. Xu changes, because back home in the village, he's big man on campus. He's one of the wealthier persons. He was working in the big city and sending money back. And as we got into his village, there are these simple structures, but they're different heights, and his is one of the highest, and that's very important to have one of the highest, tallest houses. It kind of shows that you've succeeded. It kind of shows your wealth. And one of his neighbors gave a luncheon, kind of celebrate Mr. Xu coming back with these weird American reporters. And we went to his neighbor's house, and his neighbor had this gigantic wok. It's like 4 feet across. And Mr. Xu looks at it, and he says, mine's bigger. And so he bragged a little bit, but the story was, and it's true, that in the course of a lifetime, he had kind of built this success story, kind of the human face of what China was. And, I told stories of all kinds of people who had these remarkable human stories. Coal miners and entrepreneurs who had little factories making shoes or cigarette lighters, people doing illegal things like recycling electronic waste where they weren't supposed to. I mean, but there was still an opportunity that was brought to them. And so I always felt like there was a question I wasn't asking, but I didn't know really what the question was. And I came back 4 years later from China. You know, it's daily journalism, and we're kind of spitting out these stories of not having a full, complete story of where China came from. And that's kind of where the Knight-Wallace Fellowship came in, I think. I came and I proclaimed I was writing a book, which took me a lot longer to do. But then I started interacting with my advisor and others in the China Studies program and the Economic History program and the Science and Technology program and Women's Studies. I mean, that's the opportunity you have before you to ask a longer arc question. And it was something like, well, did the Chinese story, which is relevant to where we are today, did it start maybe not in 1980, but maybe 1880, which is, you know, one of the last periods when globalization was happening in the world. That is, might the Chinese story not really be that necessarily that much of a communist Chinese story and not an instant story? You know, might the period of Mao, the communist nightmare period of the 50s and 60s, maybe that was not the start of something, but the interruption of something longer. And those are the kind of questions I think that being at a university and taking time to kind of think slow gave me entree to ask about and explore. And with a little bit of distance, I know I've talked to a couple of you about how this, you know, the fellowship starts so quickly and the information just comes, and then at a certain point when you kind of find the right cadence to pedal and to find your people, it's just this remarkable experience. And that kind of launched me to work on my book project, which eventually turned out, but I went back to China a number of times with my parents, and I kind of learned how my own family fits into this long arc of the story. And I went back with my dad to our village. The Tong family village is still there. It's like 100 people now. And we learned about the first person who got out of the village. So that's my great-grandfather. And, you know, it took about a day to find the village. We almost didn't find it. And we learned a little bit about his life. And I guess this goes to the value of education and what's so important to so many cultures, including Chinese culture, is to find a way out. So my great-grandfather was first out of the village. His village in kind of middle of nowhere, Jiangsu province in eastern China. It's along what's called the Grand Canal, longest canal in China. I'd never been there until I went to the village. And he was an exchange student, and he went to Japan. So he was with some kind of intellectuals, some became revolutionaries, and he studied a lot in Japan, and he kind of hung out with some of the revolutionaries for a little bit, but he eventually stopped doing that, and he married a Japanese wife. And he was at the place that was the most open place in Asia at the time, which was Japan. And at Waseda University, he was doing all these things, came back to China with his Japanese wife, which is a great surprise to his Chinese wife back in the village. So it's always a great story, right? And then you have to bargain with your family how much of the story you're allowed to tell. But what I learned was, you know, China has always had this kind of push and pull relationship with the outside world in this longer arc. And for the people in my family, when China was more open to the outside world, they were the opportunists. They were the students, they were the traders, they were the business people. And then when China closed up, they were the villains, and they were the, you know, they were sent to the labor camps, which, you know, is a familiar story in a lot of places in the world. So my great-grandfather, my grandmother were the recipients of this openness. And then my maternal grandfather, he's the one who went to the Gulag, and as part of the book project, I went to the labor camps there and tried to understand his situation there as well. So, and then of course, when China closed, thousands of prisoners were deemed counter-revolutionaries, and that's part of my family story as well. And now, of course, China today has taken another illiberal turn. Just when a book came out about China's opening to the world, it started to close. And And I think that informs another question that journalists are asking, that unless we're kind of stepping back, we can often get wrong. As Lynette said, in my generation, we just thought globalization was gospel. I was in college, the Berlin Wall fell, and we thought, and the gospel of Tom Friedman was that the world was flat, and that's where things were going to go, right? And when I was working for Marketplace, I did a series of stories called Back to School. And what did I miss? What did I miss in college? And I missed the notion that kind of the big question that in history, perhaps openness and globalization is the exception to history. Maybe it's not the rule. And those are the kinds of questions that I think we try to ask. We try to ask today if we're in the right moment on a good day in journalism, right, to kind of really step back. And newsrooms have their own echo chambers, as we know, and we're trying to kind of break out of those. Which takes me to the Xi Jinping era. Now, I did not live in China during his period in charge, but I went there several times to work on the book, and I did a few stories in southern China. I visited the Huawei company. And I think I have a few lessons, I think, of what maybe a lot of us and analysts missed about China and understanding it now. And one of them is narrative. We call it narrative fallacy. Right, we get married to a story. We think we understand what's going on. China was continuing to open up. It needed to open up because it needed the ideas and the money from the outside world, and it develops a kind of recency bias. And I think we all thought things directionally were going to keep going there. And in retrospect, what we didn't see beneath the surface, what a lot of scholars are saying now, is there was always, even as China was opening up and they were buying Nike shoes, that there was always a push and pull between the reformers and the ideological Marxists. And I think a lot of us didn't see that at the time. I think we saw, but maybe understated, undervalued the creeping nationalism we saw. And I covered the Olympics back in 2008. Many of us were doing stories about how China was falling over itself to kind of put on a good show and a fancy show and spending all this money and shutting down all the steel mills so the skies would be blue. It was very cynical, I think, It was all true. But what I think I certainly missed was how much of a galvanizing event it was for kind of the national pride. There was already a lot of nationalism among young people. It wasn't just canned. It wasn't just coming from above. But I feel like we missed that. And certainly I missed the creeping surveillance state. When I was there were limits on the internet, but they were pretty bad. And we called it the Great Firewall, and it was really easy to jump over the Great Firewall. I remember one of my interns at the time, he would periodically say, here's a new VPN, here's a new way to kind of get around the firewall. And it's pretty easy. I said, well, why do people want to go over the firewall? He goes, well, so there was a steamy movie called Lust, Caution that came out then. And he said, well, we all wanted to watch the uncensored version of the movie, so we could jump over the wall, and it was very easy. What I also missed was something I saw when I went to Xinjiang, that the area in the far west where the Uyghur Muslims are. And at the time, it was the only place where you land on the tarmac, and there are soldiers and military police with guns. Never see that. And security cameras everywhere. And at the time, that was new. The checks were very, in the rest of China, we almost had complete freedom, at least in Shanghai. The government had some minders who were trying to check in on us, but my producer colleagues, assistants, they would meet with them, and the producers would always say, these security people, they're pretty bad at it. At least in Shanghai, they were. They weren't really paying attention to their jobs, and of course, it's a much different place. It's a much different place right now. We've heard of what has been happening in China. We have seen other leaders who've been made examples of, as Xi Jinping consolidated his power there. We've seen crackdowns on different parts of the economy, which some of us thought were unthinkable. I mean, these are the engines of the Chinese economy: tutoring and video games. Ideology has come back with a vengeance. And we, of course, have seen the harsh crackdowns of the zero COVID policy in a lot of Chinese cities. I keep in touch with one American friend. Kent is from Minnesota. And the last time I talked to him, his whole building was going on crackdown because they had a positive case there. And he has these 2 dogs, and they're each like 120 pounds. So how am I going to walk my dogs? And I said, well, you can't, because you can't come down. So he went out and bought a bunch of dirt, put it on his balcony, and that was like his gigantic dog litter box as he was trying to survive. So so the question is, I think I have a lot of family in China still, and even as it has this profile in the world right now, China matters so much more to all of our daily lives than when I was there. There's a lot of questions about where things go from now, and so some of the questions I have are, well, what happens as it slows down? We know it's slowing down. We know hundreds of millions of people, despite what we see on television and network television, is hundreds of millions of people are still very, very poor in China. And the safety net is so porous. So for the people there, for the people in my village, what happens when those opportunities that seemed endless are not so much anymore? That in a way China is, sounds crazy, but kind of running out of what's called surplus labor, right? They don't have as many workers relative to old people. What happens to innovation? China has always been really good at what some call kind of incremental innovation. You take something that has been invented, scale it, make it cheaper, make it well, all of our phones, and it's always been, well, how do we develop this kind of apple falls from the tree, a brand new kind of innovation? It's always been a challenge in China, and the more the government controls the economy, the harder that kind of stuff gets. And they know it. I mean, you don't need an analyst to show you a company that's full of bureaucracy. So what happens to that? If the world wants a China that can grow and buy our stuff and present things to the world, what happens to innovation? What happens with inflation? I didn't realize, I was in high school for when the Tiananmen Square events massacre happened in '89. And I didn't realize until moving to China that a fair amount of what that was about was not just democracy and corruption, but it was food prices. And we have surely seen that in other parts of the world. So what happens there if, those are some of the fragilities that Chinese people know. Will we move to this decoupled world? We've heard about this potential technology iron curtain where China and many of its allies are under one set of rules or certain technologies, and the rest of the world uses another set of technologies. This brings obviously the big surveillance question. That is, of course, still a debate that's raging. Certainly not a sure thing, but what might that mean if the world is separated that way? And there is so much hostility to China in the U.S. now, and certainly in Washington. Where does China send its best and brightest? Because fewer and fewer of them are coming to this country. And so who loses there? And Lynette, of course, mentioned Hong Kong. My mom grew up in Hong Kong, and it was always this gem of a place of critical thinking, independent thinking, customer service, culture, all of these things for ethnic Chinese people. And much of that is gone and not expected to come back. You may know the name Louisa Lim. She's a former fellow. She was my year 2013 and 14. She was with the BBC and NPR in China. She's now in Australia. She's written a remarkable personal book on Hong Kong and what has happened to it as these freedoms have eroded. And she writes that there was this mirage of calm back in '97 when we all saw Hong Kong revert from the British to mainland Chinese, and how the Hong Kong people were never in the frame. In 1843, when it went to the British in the first place, they were not in the frame. When it reverted to the Communist Party in '97, they were not at the table. They were never in the frame. And it is, as she puts it, this long story of erasure. So speaking of kind of things that we thought were unthinkable as Lynette mentioned, are happening. They have happened in Hong Kong. So I'd encourage you to read Louise's book. And of course, what does it mean for Taiwan? From far away, for me, I think it's very hard to know. Certainly have been keeping up with some analysis and podcasts suggesting, Beijing is certainly taking notes of what's happening in Ukraine, and they're seeing that war and occupation is pretty hard, is pretty difficult, right? They have seen the resistance that they didn't expect, and the Communist Party is filing that away for sure. They've also seen that sanctions from the West, didn't totally sink the Russian economy. So if that were to come and China were to do something, perhaps that's instructive too about how the Chinese economy might be able to continue on. But I think our job is to ask the unthinkable questions. I remember on Here and Now, mid-February, interviewing the Washington Post reporter Isabel Kershudian. She was in Kyiv in Ukraine, and we kept hearing, I live in Washington, about this kind of drumbeat of the Russian and where the Russian and that the inevitable attack was coming. And she said, well, here in Kyiv, the people all say, why are you Americans kind of overdoing this? The ATMs still work, and we're still going about our lives, and we know the place better than you all do. And a few people have their bags ready to go, but otherwise, life kind of proceeds apace. And 4 days later, we know what happened. So, and then we had her back on, and she goes, well, even for me, even for the Ukrainian people, this was the unthinkable, and it does happen. So we're at a time in the world where I think we have to kind of step back and ask those broader questions. And sometimes I think in daily journalism, those questions are kind of hard to ask because we're just cranking stuff out. I mean, when I'm on deadline, it's like fast food, right? John Belushi, cheeseburger, 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 cheeseburger. And so how do you step back and ask the questions? But we have to, right? Because we're seeing the authoritarianism that's happening in the world. And we have to try to interview and talk to people who might challenge kind of the prevailing American wisdom. So I remember we had Kevin Rudd on our show, one of the foremost Chinese scholars and the former Prime Minister of Australia. And he spent some time with Xi Jinping, not a lot, but he, his analysis has shown to be very, he's a hardcore academic with regards to China, and he believes that, the Taiwan reunification, air quotes, is, something that is pretty high on the list of what Xi Jinping wants to achieve in his time. And he's Kevin Rudd's written a book on that recently, and I said, well, what's the time frame for that? He says, well, in the next 10 to 15 years, that would be in his interest to do that. So then what do we do with that information? We do hear that there doesn't seem to be any urgency on the Chinese side, but they're slowly building up their military, and this asymmetry of their military strength, which compared to Taiwan, increasingly grows. And the military analysts who follow this closely, they wonder, if there were an attack and America says it's committed, would the Americans get there in time? Because Taiwan is so close to mainland China, of course, as America has one eye on Ukraine instead. So one thing as I think about the rising authoritarianism in the world, I think of the other Pulitzer Prize winner, Maria Ressa. And she came on our program Here and Now, and she said, I've been telling you Americans from the Philippines since 2016, what's happening here might go over there. And she was referencing Duterte, the president there, and she was warning about Viktor Orban in Hungary and Bolsonaro in Brazil, and she said, it might be coming for you. I think of Freedom House, right, the nonprofit that says democracy has been backsliding in the world for 16 years in a row. And I think about Max Fisher at the New York Times, who kind of watches this, and his analysis is often the authoritarians first come into office through a democratic election, and then they tear it down. So think Hugo Chavez. I think, those are some of the people we have to pay some serious attention to and figure out as journalists how to frame things, to leave space to ask those questions. In our show, we like to say we're not prisoners of the daily news. So on a good day, we do some of this jailbreak journalism and ask these big questions. But it's hard, right? There's so many other competing things to do. On our Knight-Wallace group in 2014, we went to Turkey. And I'm sorry, your group is not going to travel internationally, so frowning COVID emoji, I guess. We went to Turkey, and it was a year after these. There were these protests in Istanbul over threats of increasing Islamization, and it was quite violent. And I remember one of the tour guides who was with us, who was explaining this to me and what was happening in Turkey, a very new part of the world to me. And then he said, yeah, I was there. I said, well, you were part of these protests? Like, why were you there? You have a solid, he said, well, I have a daughter, and she's 3. And so what's the Turkey that she's going to live in? So I've kind of kept that with me for a long time. So, I'm a host of a co-host of a daily show on public radio, so I'm no expert in surging populism, but a couple thoughts from very different disciplines of kind of ingredients of what, might be driving some of this. And one is the data has seemed to make clear there's a growing group of economically aggrieved people in the world. I don't know if any of you, maybe business reporters, have heard of the elephant chart. Which is a great way to kind of think about the people since the 80s who economically have not gotten better at all. So with the elephant, you have the people who are very low income, and their incomes have gone through the roof, right? India, China, other emerging economies. And that's the back of the elephant. And then when it kind of goes down to the neck, there are people around the 60, 70, 80th percentile. So those are in the world. So those are kind of in advanced economies in North America and Western Europe. Those are kind of economically the lower class of North America and Western Europe. And as far as income, they haven't gone anywhere. And they've seen people all around them, right, see their incomes go up. And then, of course, the snout, I guess the elephant is the top 5%, and they've done super well too since the 1980s. So I think that's one discipline that kind of helps us to understand this backlash. And the other is sociology. How many of you have read Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild? It is a great, I had an opportunity to host her for a book talk, and her book came out in 2016, and she's an emeritus Berkeley professor, sociologist, so, in one of the bluest parts of America, kind of like where I live in Arlington, Virginia, or maybe here. And she said, I have never met a person from the Tea Party before, and I need to understand it as a professional, as a sociologist. And she spent 5 years off and on in Louisiana, kind of deep red Louisiana, Lake Charles by Cancer Alley there, just trying to understand the stories that they tell themselves, to understand that. And I just find it fascinating because I had the same questions of very easy to be dismissive, right, of people you don't really understand. And so she dove in. And in the end, she came away from her research, and she's a sociologist who thinks about stories. And what is the story that these Tea Party adherents, at least in Louisiana, what's the story they tell themselves? And this is just her schematic. And the view is of a big, long line, which is the American dream. And they're kind of waiting in line. The American dream line goes over a hill, and people are waiting for their turn. And as the story goes, they're waiting in line. The line doesn't go anywhere, and there are all these line cutters. So all these people are cutting in line as they see it. Ethnic minorities, women, immigrants, LGBTQ. I mean, that's the framing. Even endangered species. Again, this is her representing this view from there. Just trying to kind of understand the story of how people kind of see how the world is changing. And to me, that's very helpful to just try to understand that and why this might be amplifying right now. So finally, for journalism, how do we think about this? How does our job fit into this? I think, we like to think we have the answers. We need a lot of humility because a lot of unthinkable things have happened. I think we need to challenge our assumptions. We have to challenge narrative fallacy. We have to not get married to a particular story. I mean, we saw the health experts at the WHO get COVID wrong, right? They kept saying it was transmitted by water and these other things. They didn't come around to air for a long time. The same way the experts, in the 1800s got the cholera wrong, right? They thought it certainly had to been the air and it was the water. I think we need to call out, facts against non-facts. Like long ago, I was covering it here on Capitol Hill, and this is a cliche now, and Senator Pat Moynihan of New York said, "You're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts." And here we are. Alternative facts, right? NPR, to its credit, just announced a misinformation reporting team. So I think we have to, call the facts as we see them, as they are. I think sometimes we need to embed in places for a long time to just kind of understand why this populist support is happening in the world. And finally, I think we need experts like those who are at the university here. That book, Thinking Fast and Slow, by Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral scientist. The idea is that if we think too fast, we take all these mental shortcuts, and it leads to all this cognitive bias, and we miss stuff. And if we step back and kind of think slow and kind of spend time challenging our assumptions, then maybe we have to take these shortcuts sometimes. But I think some of the answers are on campuses like these, to understand, to go to the experts who are having these conversations that matter to us. And finally, it takes me back to China. My grandmother, who was part of this opening era, she had an opportunity as a 6-year-old to go to a boarding school run by American missionaries. And her feet were bound, and so they unbound her feet. And she went to this school, and she always wanted to go to America for where her teachers were from. One advisor was from Rome, New York, and the Erie Canal, and there's another one, I think, from Connecticut. And it was this great moment of opening and promise, and she never got to come to America. But, so that was, carried out the next generation and the generation later. So, but as somebody who's been able to live outside of America for a little while and to kind of see ourselves from the outside, I think, like my grandmother, the promise is still here. I think the critical thinking is still here. The academic scholarship is here. The freedom of the press is still here. And the opportunity to kind of do your group edits and do the important work that you do is still here. Thank you all very much. Yeah.
So we have time for questions, and we'll come around if you raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone to you.
This might be easy.
Scott, you actually came to one of my classes, but you didn't stay for the rest of it back then when you were a fellow. I'm over here on the Monkey King.
Yes.
But anyway, I'd like to push you to
Yes.
talk about the two parts of your title more strongly. And to me, Xi Jinping kind of smells of fear because he realizes he's weak. All these people, their number one concern is to stay in power. Whether it's Trump, he'd like to stay out of jail, right? And then Putin, and also Xi Jinping. So could you talk more about the relationship between the weakness and the authoritarianism in your title?
You know, I mean, it seems to me so much harder than even a decade ago when I was in your class to understand China and to have people to follow, for journalists to be there, and for even Chinese scholars to speak freely about some of these questions. It's in the past, I felt like we could kind of read tea leaves, and there were certain Chinese experts who had some freedom to even speak in code a little bit about the challenges there. So, you know, I think to me, I listen to some of the analysts who are very concerned about the Chinese economy. We've always, as business reporters, we were always skeptical about the statistics. And initially, at the start, we thought the statistics were understated, and now very likely overstated. And so, if the model is going in the wrong direction, and if the government is controlling more and more of the economy, and they all know that in the end, it could, those are the companies that don't innovate and have no ideas. And as China gets old before it gets rich, it seems like it will be a big challenge. So what the event is, I don't know. And, you know, is his power seem secure now? It sure seems like that is to me. But structurally, you know, what happens if as the economy keeps getting squeezed from the outside? We think of it is a behemoth economy. It's going to surpass ours. But when it slows down and hundreds of millions of people from the countryside still need to get jobs and come to the cities, that's a squeeze.
We have one back here.
Hi, thank you, Scott. Maybe you can help me understand something from just the news today. The relationship between China and Russia after the Ukraine invasion seems critically important, yet today we read that it may be not as strong as we thought it was. What's the long game here? Why is China doing this? What could break the relationship with Russia? What could strengthen it?
You know, it seems, I think it seemed clear even before the invasion that geopolitically, the Chinese leaders were thinking about their long-term friends in the world that could provide them natural resources. China is very scarce in natural resources, including energy, and Russia was near the top of the list. So I think for those interests, you know, Russia has long been an important ally for China's own interests, and certainly its alliances and international organizations that is trying to, you know, throw its weight around to. During the invasion in Ukraine, to me, it seemed to me that the Chinese were always reluctant to provide a lot of arms and weapons to the Russians because I think they were worried that it could, you know, destabilize things in the world. So I feel like China has, my sense is they've been in kind of a tough place the whole time. And at the same time, Xi Jinping and Putin, right, not long before the invasion, they had this kind of bro moment, right, when they pledged that they were going to be strong friends and allies. But China has so many problems going on at home, right? Notably COVID, but other things, that this doesn't seem to me it comes at a very good time for China to do. And so how does it kind of balance still trying to grow, still trying to build this military, you know, still trying to stay kind of stable, and then having this destabilizing event in the world. So it seems to me there are definitely pluses and minuses, and now we see, of course, what's happening in northeastern Ukraine with the Russian retreat.
I saw another hand here and then here. Alexis?
Yeah, I want to ask a question along the lines of David's, actually. We come from the same place, actually. I think that if Deng Xiaoping were to look at your title, I think he might say that there's no paradox there, that actually authoritarian is the source of weakness. And especially the Xi Jinping style of authoritarianism, where he's done away with the kind of consensus idea, limited terms, keeping low, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
that
bide your
sort of
time
stuff.
and yeah.
So as we approach the 20th Party Congress, and you think about the damage that's been done to the economy, public support for the party, so many things that were, as you say, characteristic of Shanghai half a decade ago even.
Yeah.
What is your take on his prospects, what's likely to happen at the 20th NPC, and whether in fact there more and more articles now are beginning to appear pointing to what David was talking about, the fear, the paranoia, the anxiety he has as he approaches this unprecedented third term and maybe starts to lose some control of the standing committee?
I guess I haven't read or talked to many analysts who don't think it will go according to the script, right? That he will get another term, and that when a big event in China happens, the internet is controlled very well, and any of those who might have an opposing point of view, they kind of stay quiet for a little bit. So that's what I would anticipate happening. I guess the question is where would the kind of resistance come from? And it's so hard to for me or the people I try to talk to regularly is to understand where that would come from. I mean, it's been a remarkable, as you're describing, kind of change, consolidation of the story and of his personal control. You mentioned in previous administrations, it was very important to have a peaceful transfer of power and for leaders to kind of leave the scene in a peaceful way, and it was part of this stable structure. So it is all changed, but surely Xi Jinping has kind of made it to where he is by worrying about these things every day, I would think, and being able to kind of execute those. Exactly what I don't know what they are, but my experience, at least having been in Taiwan, in China, and around China during official events, is it's hard to report because nothing happens because nobody says anything.
I think we have time for one more question. I saw one back here.
Hi, Scott. You kind of touched on this a little bit in your last answer, but with the restrictions on the press and the restrictions on the internet and the media, I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about what you saw and heard from people and how is there a level of what the level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction might be among people, and how the Chinese people understand their country's place in the world?
I was surprised how many people were very satisfied with their life, and how little they paid attention to the questions I was asking them. Don't you worry about the internet? Not really. Do you worry about what's happening far away in Beijing and the controls? Not really. I have a cousin there. He's about a decade younger than I am, and he works for General Motors. And he has a nicer bicycle than I have. He has a sleeker laptop computer than I have. And on one hand, he was born just before the one-child policy came into play. And his life every year has statistically and experientially gotten better. And he has these opportunities. He has more food to try. I mean, all these things to do. So that was unexpected for me and people I talked to. They didn't always kind of gushed about how much better the lives were, but you could see it and you could tell. And they either made their peace with not talking about political stuff, or they really didn't care, because even with the internet, everything they wanted to do on the internet, for most people, you could do. So that was my sense, and when I went back, I think it continued to be my sense. Now, the big area of stress, using my cousin as an example again, is he's an only child, and so he has to someday take care of 2 parents and maybe 4 grandparents. And the pressure that has put on him his whole life, the expectations he's had his whole life. And his father aced the college entrance examination, which kind of led to this remarkable life, and he didn't do so well. And if you don't do so well and you don't own property, you don't get married. So those are some of the challenges. Is things were improving, things were getting better, but compared to everyone else, everyone's kind of running, and some people are running faster than you are, and that matters, right? Social capital, it matters, and not everyone has as much.
And I just want to acknowledge that's Doug Trabue, also former Knight-Wallace Fellow. I don't have a full line of sight, but former Knight-Wallace Fellows who are here with us, if you could stand up so we can give you a hand as well. Scott, I need to switch places with you because there's something important over here in this green box, in this crinkly white paper. So every year we present, come on over here, the Hovey Bowl. And I've said before that I don't actually know why it's a bowl. My theory is that it's because we're journalists and we need something to catch our tears when we weep. And
It's not that bad. It's a lot of tears.
it can hold a lot. So this is your engraved Hovey Bowl.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. We also have a reception coming so that people can ask more questions and keep pushing on this idea of authoritarianism as weakness. I think it's a really interesting question. Here's your bowl. Here's your bowl. Oh, I think Phil wants a picture of the bowl. Okay. And I also want to, this is a little bit more unwieldy, but for those of you who have been inside Wallace House, right inside the front door in the foyer, if you turn and face the door as you're going, like you're going out, this hangs to the right, to the left side, and this is all of our Hovey speakers. And looking at it, when I started, I realized that at some point during my tenure, we would have to get a new plaque because we'd fill this one up and we'd continue having Hovey speakers. But I never actually imagined that we would have 2 years where there were no Hovey speakers. And so, Scott, you'll be here and your name will be engraved on this plaque. But we've been talking about we can't just have blank space, right? We are journalists, and it will be important 100 years from now when somebody looks at this to understand that there were 2 years where there was no Hovey Lecture because there was a global pandemic. And so we will have something engraved here that acknowledges COVID, followed by your name.
That's a tough one to follow, COVID.
And when I was thinking about who to come and talk, it felt to me really natural and logical that it should be you. And listening to Scott talk, I think you can agree. And for the fellows, I just really appreciate how you were able to put in perspective for them, because they are all at the point now where we've been introducing them to so much over the past couple of weeks, and I've been doing one-on-one meetings and sort of reinforcing, now's your time to slow down. Don't worry about not being productive. You have to slow down, you have to think, you have to explore the university, introduce yourself to people. and to hear you talk to them about the richness of your own experience here, and for you all to be able to see what it yielded. I hope that that gives you inspiration, and you'll help them listen to me when I tell them to slow down.
It does slow down. Okay. Congratulations, all of you.
And Melissa is reminding me to tell you that Literati, which is a great partner of ours in town, is here with Scott's book. And if you didn't get a chance to see it or purchase it before the event, it is here. And I hope that you will all stay and mingle. Wallace House, we have loved what we've been able to do for the past 2 years. But this place, this yard, is meant to be filled with journalists. It is meant to be filled with ideas. It is meant to be filled with provocation and interesting conversation and with community. And so thank you for helping us bring back a sense of community to this place, and we hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you very much.